To outsiders, it looks like a family at war with itself. Ethiopia and Eritrea's relationship encapsulates the challenges facing African nations post-colonial rule. Ethiopians and Eritreans yearn for more kinship between the two countries, but the barriers still exist. There is a sensitive border dispute costing thousands of lives, and Eritrea is facing a crippling refugee crisis. Meanwhile, Ethiopia, Africa's largest recipient of US aid, has been criticized for selling its soul to the West. Are all these problems just the result of an ongoing legacy of divide and rule? Join Africa Today for an update on Eritrea and Ethiopia's seeming war without end.
Both Ethiopia and Eritrea stand accused of human rights violations. Eritrea faces a refugee crisis as thousands flee to avoid conscription in a never-ending border war with Ethiopia. Ethiopia's controversial villagization policy of forcibly moving indigenous Ethiopians out of their ancestral homelands and leasing the land to foreign interests is seen as a violation of human rights. The World Bank is reported to have allocated nearly $2 billion towards villagization. Due to its resistance to US control of its emerging independence, Eritrea has long been labeled an enemy of the West. Meanwhile, events post 9/11 have been a blessing for the Ethiopian government, which has had US support since the end of the Cold War. In recent times, Eritrea is labeled an ally of al-Shabaab in Somalia and suffers under UN sanctions, whilst Ethiopia was contracted to fight al-Shabaab. Are the US and UK funding a dictatorship in Ethiopia, and is the Eritrean government on the brink of collapse? Ethiopians and Eritreans are genetically and historically part of the same family. This week, Africa Today focuses on how these geopolitical dynamics currently impact the peoples of both countries, asking what will it take to stop the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea?
I'm Vuiswang Mobongwana welcoming you to Africa Today. Is it too simplistic to call Eritrea a Marxist-style dictatorship and Ethiopia a neo-colonial puppet regime? What's it like for ordinary Eritreans and Ethiopians, and why is the legacy of liberation struggles so hard to overcome? With me to discuss and give us an update on current issues are Professor Richard Reid, who's the Professor of the History of Africa at SOAS here in London, Selam Kidan, who's a human rights activist, and political researcher Goitam Gebruwel, who'll be joining us from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Thank you all for joining us. If I could start with you, please, Selam. You're an Eritrean yourself. One of the difficulties about Eritrea in terms of getting information is that it's very hard to find. Now, from your perspective, living here in the West, how would you summarize the situation in your country? Very quickly.
It is very difficult to get official information, but with so many people leaving Eritrea, it's not difficult to get information from refugees coming out of Eritrea. And also by phoning our friends and relatives, we do get quite a lot of information. Every young able-bodied person is meant to go to the national service, and it's an endless national service, so it's interminable as far as we can see.
Open-ended, you could be there from
the age of 16 for some people to indefinitely until you leave the country. That's why you see so many people leaving.
I think actually the maximum is 40 according to official documents.
Yes. That's official documents, but if you ask how many people have been demobilized and what have they been demobilized to, you will not get that information.
Right, right. So young people are leaving because of open-ended conscription. And what about the conditions inside the country?
Well, the living conditions are very harsh. Everything is very expensive. People are forced to buy things when it is available from government subsidized shops, but they're not necessarily available. There's a lot of scarcity. There's a lack of medical care, so people have to come out of the country to get medical care in Sudan and further afield if they can afford it.
Okay, but part of the dilemma with regard to getting good infrastructure within Eritrea and services for its people, Professor Reid, is that UN sanctions have been quite a biting factor within this equation. Otherwise, we give the impression that the government doesn't care for its people. How big a factor have the UN sanctions been?
They've clearly been very important. I mean, they've isolated Eritrea. They've cut off what one might regard as natural sources of aid and assistance and the normal routes available to sovereign states in terms of economic cooperation and so on in the region. But actually...
And definitely no aid or support from any outside sources except perhaps non-Western ones?
Non-Western ones to a very low, at a very low level, but nothing else is getting in. I mean,
Right.
but you could actually suggest that the sanctions have not substantively changed ordinary Eritreans' lives compared to what they were, 15, 20 years ago. Eritrea was not particularly open as a country before sanctions. So in many ways, sanctions are one part of the problem, but they're only part of a wider set of issues.
Well, they've certainly exacerbated what were already challenging conditions. If I could bring you in, Goitam, there. From what you're aware of, you're in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. You've got a feel for the general, public view of this dilemma between Ethiopia and Eritrea. What do you pick up as you do your work as a journalist and a researcher? Are the arguments as polarized as they appear to be from this end?
Certainly, that is my own perception. Inside Ethiopia, there is a new development where there is very little interest for Eritrean affairs within the general public here. Some 10 years ago, Eritrea was probably the most important foreign policy issue for most Ethiopians and certainly the government. But over the last 10 years, there's been a general disinterest and disconnect between the Ethiopian public and Eritrea as a nation.
Why is that?
Well, one thing is that the stalemate between Ethiopia and Eritrea has been had very significant implications for ordinary Eritreans and Eritrean political affairs, Eritrean foreign policy, etc. For Ethiopia, it has had minimal effects. It hasn't had a big impact on its economy. It has been booming for the last 10 years. It has had very little impact on its domestic stability. Only in terms of regional politics has it had an effect. So the ordinary Ethiopian has sort of forgot about the stalemate, if you like.
Right, right. And if I could bring you back in, Salam, the question about the refugees and the issue of why people have to be conscripted in the first place, at least in terms of the Eritrean government's thinking, is that they obviously must feel under threat. So what is the big block to stopping the implementation of the agreement on the Badme border issue?
Yeah, let me start with that border issue. I really do think on that issue that it is actually the Ethiopian regime that is in the wrong. There is an agreement, there is an international agreement that has to be implemented, and it's Ethiopia stalling on that. So there is, I mean, the onus is on Ethiopia.
Okay.
However, although the regime in Eritrea uses the border issue, the border conflict, as a pretext for having a huge army and conscripting everybody, if you look at the rates of defections or the rates, the number of people that are actually defecting into Ethiopia and into Sudan, holding an entire generation hostage to that situation is not going to safeguard the border, is not going to maintain Eritrea's interest or its sovereignty for that matter. So I don't think from the perspectives of the Eritrean nation, from the nationals, from the perspectives of the young people, certainly, it is not the best way of maintaining Eritrea's interest.
But also, Professor Reid, Ethiopia itself has its own issues, because I'm reading about defections from Ethiopian military staff who are leaving the country. I mean, what are the main issues there? Because we hear about it having huge amounts of funding, economy is booming, everything looks relatively okay. So what's the governance issue there?
Well, Ethiopia has its own issues. It is a multi-ethnic society. It's always struggled with levels of representation of certain groups at the centre. You see a lot of reform in the last 20 years in terms of local governance. But Ethiopia...
When you say representation, are you talking about what people call the indigenous, darker-skinned African communities? Some people will have seen them wearing the plates on their lips. These groups are being moved out in the villagization
yes, absolutely.
process.
I mean
so is there a divide in society? Those are lower than us.
Yes, Ethiopian history has often been defined by that very basic division between a highland vision of what the nation state should be and those more peripheral peoples who in recent years we've seen sidelined by the great kind of dam building exercises in the south. The successive Ethiopian regimes have regarded these peoples generally with contempt, and they are not like Eritrea in their the levels of political centralism, but Ethiopia is still very sensitive to internal division, and
but it seemingly is creating it with the villagization process. Because are Ethiopians benefiting from that? Because what I'm reading is that a lot of the contracts are going to foreign entrepreneurs and corporations who are putting a very strong stake in Ethiopia.
Oh yes, the Ethiopian economy is very outward-looking, shall we say, is probably the most neutral way of putting it. I mean, you go to Addis today and there are frequent electricity shortages, there's huge parts of the city in darkness with no water, etc. So I think, absolutely, this is an economy which is very much oriented toward the external investor. Right.
And as we move on in our discussion, we're going to actually see what the impact might be, or discuss speculatively what the long-term impact might be on Eritrea. Is it actually on the brink of collapse, as perhaps some analysts are wishing here in the West? I do read a lot of stuff about Eritrea being a very negative country. Let us know what you think. Here are some thoughts from our Facebook fan page. We have 3 comments. Zeru Teague says that Ethiopians and Eritreans are genetically and historically parts of the same family. I personally believe no matter what, we still are the same people from the same land.